Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back and welcome to my February reading wrap-up, coming at you smack dab in the middle of March. As I mentioned in my recent book haul, February was just kind of the pits and I didn't get a whole lot of reading done last month, but I am here today to talk about 3 whole books, so buckle up and let's dive right in. The first 2 books I want to talk about today are Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich and Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. And the reason I mention them together is that they are both these polyphonic, multi-generational novels that span decades and brim with many, many characters. Love Medicine looks at the lives and various relational entanglements between 2 families living on an Ojibwe reservation in North Dakota, and Girl, Woman, Other sketches out the interconnected biographies of a dozen Black British characters, most of them women, one of them non-binary. And in most ways, these 2 books could not be more different, but reading them one after the other did give me an opportunity to think about my relationship as a reader with these expansive, multi-character, multi-generational novels and what makes these kinds of books either successful or unsuccessful for me. And so I wanted to start with Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, which I found to be the more successful and effective of these 2 novels. Love Medicine was originally published in 1984. It was Louise Erdrich's debut novel, and like I said, it's set on a fictional Ojibwe reservation in North Dakota, and it follows the various branches and offshoots of these 2 deeply intertwined families, the Capshaws and the Lamartines. The book opens with June Capshaw, who disappears in a blizzard while walking home in 1981. After her death, a number of the Capshaws converge on the family home in a fraught kind of gathering that slowly unravels into various complicated expressions of grief. This scene introduces you to several key characters in the book, and from there the novel reaches back to 1934 and proceeds to unfold in a roughly linear series of stories and vignettes that each center on different members of the Capshaw and Lamartine families. Structurally, Love Medicine is a highly episodic novel, and initially it almost feels like you're reading a book of interconnected short stories. There's the story of Marie Lazar, June's aunt who eventually becomes the matriarch of the Capshaw family, and her violent girlhood clashes with Catholicism. There's Lulu Lamartine, this force of a woman whose many Lamartine boys are known to have nearly as many different fathers. There's Lipsha Morrissey, who has what he describes as the touch or an ability to bestow healing with his hands, at least until a day when his attempt to conjure love medicine goes horribly wrong. And a number of the stories that comprise Love Medicine were in fact previously published as standalone pieces. And while it isn't initially entirely clear how all of these different episodes tie together, what you end up getting in lieu of traditional narrativity are these chapters that feel remarkably fully formed and fully realized and potent on their own. But then when you do read them collectively, with each successive chapter, you do experience this slow but total immersion into Louise Erdrich's world building. And you also get a deepening understanding of the relationships and the histories and the tangled webs of kinship that tie all of these characters to each other. And in a way, reading the stories in Love Medicine does feel a bit like holding individually crafted beads in the palm of your hand and then threading them one after the other onto the same string. And what you get by the end of the book is less a complete and finished necklace or whatever, and more just a profound sense of that string, of that connection and continuance, and the blending of the individual and collective story. And that's an idea that Louise Erdrich evokes in a number of different images throughout the book, including this passage from the chapter called Lulu's Boys. Lulu's boys had grown into a kind of pack. They always hung together. When a shot went true, their gangling legs, encased alike in faded denim, shifted as if a ripple went through them collectively. They moved in dance steps too intricate for the non-initiated eye to imitate or understand. Clearly, they were of one soul, handsome, rangy, wildly various. They were bound in total loyalty, not by oath, but by the simple, unquestioning belongingness of part of one organism. In addition to that that living, breathing connective tissue that exists between these characters and between these stories, Louise Erdrich is also able to create this sense of scope throughout the book that at once feels intimate and vast. And she's able to do that in part through her masterful use of images and through an approach to literary world building that articulates a kind of realism that includes everyday tactile details, a canning jar, a mottled plastic cup, and this more expansive, all-encompassing vision of what constitutes the real. There's a scene in this novel, for example, where a house sets on fire, and it is both grounded in real human actions. We literally see the hand that drops the match that ultimately lights the house on fire, but at the same time, it also feels like this manifestation of the forces and feelings that have been raging between these two particular characters over the course of many, many years. And it really is a rare writer who has the skill and power to convey so much in terms of character and story and world within single images and single scenes. And Erdrich does, for the most part, eschew a more bird's eye expository kind of storytelling in favor of keeping you really close to these characters. And although we may not know the entirety of any one character's life or biography, and although in some instances we may only spend a handful of scenes with them, we nevertheless understand all of these characters and the world that they inhabit on a deep, visceral level, thanks to the selectiveness and the exceptional force of Erdrich's storytelling. Not many writers can do that, and not many writers, for that matter, have the confidence or the trust in the reader to also let the gaps in those characters' lives do their own kind of storytelling. Which brings me to Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. Like Love Medicine, Girl, Woman, Other is an episodic novel that follows an array of interconnected characters spread across decades and generations. Each of the 12 chapters focuses on a different character, most of whom identify as women, many of whom are queer, and several of whom consider themselves radical feminists. And collectively, all of these stories give you this varied and energetic picture of either Black British womanhood and or Black British queer experience throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Which isn't to say that the stories in Girl, Woman, Other are wholly representative of every corner of Black British female or queer identity, but when taken together, the lives of the characters in this book do at least suggest, in a really thrilling way, a kind of endless multiplicity of these kinds of stories and experiences. That being said, the chapters in this book are less fully formed stories than they are these kind of broad biographical sketches that often highlight key events or turning points in these characters' lives, but that rarely ever sit still with them in any one moment. And I enjoyed reading about a number of these 12 characters. I was really pulled into a couple of the early chapters about Amma and Dominique, who are these radical Black lesbian feminists whose earnest politics Evaristo renders both seriously and playfully. I also loved the chapter about Hattie, who is a 93-year-old matriarch who has lived in this ancient farmhouse her entire life. But despite the interesting and often intriguing details of these characters' lives, their chapters are all written and structured in more or less the same way. And the further you get into the book, the more repetitive the beats of these biographies start to feel. It almost always goes like childhood, career, sex and relationships, political orientation, and then at some point there is a challenge or hardship to overcome, and then the overcoming of said challenge or hardship. And for me, it all just felt a bit too tidy, both within the individual stories and on a broader level when looking at how all of these stories tie together. The book literally ends with this unlikely reconciliation that I think is emblematic of how the links between all of these characters often feel like all too convenient Love Actually style reveals. And then if that wasn't enough, several of these storylines do converge at the end of the book at a theatrical production. And while more seriously, I do think that perhaps these connections are saying something about the mixed and multicultural and interconnected nature of modern British society, I also do think that they I often felt quite gimmicky in very predictable ways. But honestly, my biggest issue with Girl, Woman, Other is that it fell into the trap that a lot of these multi-generational novels do for me, which is that it tries to tell you too much about its characters, and it leans too heavily on exposition as its main tool for trying to achieve a sense of narrative scope and historical import. But in its pursuit of that grand sense of breadth and scope, what you end up getting is a novel that never stands still in any one place. A novel that is more montage and recitation of past events than actual scenes. You don't really spend time with these characters so much as you glide over the surface of their lives. And you don't get to know them as real people so much as you come to understand what they're meant to represent narratively and thematically. And in that way, Girl, Woman, Other fails to create those deep wells of storytelling and character and world building that makes a book like Love Medicine such a rich and satisfying read. And that's not to unfairly dunk on Girl, Woman, Other. Like I said earlier, that issue of breadth versus depth and broad expository storytelling is one that I often encounter in multi-generational novels, and it's one of the reasons that I'm often not particularly drawn to them. So this comparison is less a massive pointed critique of Girl, Woman, Other, which I did enjoy reading, and more a way for me to articulate what I found so rare and exceptional about Love Medicine. You know, for me, the difference between reading a book like Girl, Woman, Other and reading a book like Love Medicine is kind of the difference between a lovely, vibrant bouquet of flowers and a redwood tree. And before moving on to the last book, I did want to note that Love Medicine is part of Louise Erdrich's broader, loosely connected Love Medicine series, which Danny from Thunderbird Woman Reads did a whole video on. Danny is an Ojibwe Own Voices reviewer for those books, and she has also hosted a Love Medicine read-along over on Instagram with Erin from Erin's Library, so I'm going to include links to all of that down below if you want to learn more about Love Medicine and the Love Medicine series. Lastly, changing gears to talk about my February romance reading, last month I read another Bridgerton book, despite my ongoing, perhaps misguided personal attempts to write off historical romance as a subgenre. I ended up picking up The Viscount Who Loved Me, which is the second book in Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series, and it's also going to be the basis for the second season of the Netflix show. And after bitching about romancing Mr. Bridgerton and Regency romance writ large last month, I am here to eat a little bit of crow because I mostly enjoyed this book. And I gave this one a try because I did really enjoy Jonathan Bailey's performance as Anthony in the Netflix show. I think he lent a lot of humor and campiness and charisma to a character who on paper is objectively an asshole. And so when they announced the casting for Kate, who is Anthony's love interest in The Viscount Who Loved Me, I did get excited despite myself and was like, well, let me just read the book now so I don't have to wait until next Christmas to find out what happens. The basis of this book is that Anthony Bridgerton, the oldest of the Bridgerton siblings, has finally decided to settle down and find a wife after years of rakish behavior. But he's only doing so because he knows he needs to pass on the title of Viscount. And in fact, because his own father died quite young, Anthony has this irrational belief that he too will die young, and so he's not interested in a love match. He's just interested in finding a solid wife who won't be too emotionally devastated when he ultimately kicks the can at age 38 or whatever. And so he sets his sights on Edwina Sheffield, who is the incomparable of the season, but then of course he ends up falling for Edwina's plainer, protective older sister Kate, who hates Anthony's guts. And I think the reason that I enjoyed this book so much more than I was expecting is that at the end of the day, it's basically just a period piece screwball rom-com. Like, the enemies to lovers banter is sharp, there are a lot of fun set pieces like the infamous Pall Mall game, and even the way that Kate and Anthony get compromised is kind of hilarious and ridiculous if you read it that way. So yeah, it was a surprisingly playful book, and while the conflict in the third act does feel a bit ridiculous because it's just basically Anthony trying to convince himself that he's not fully obsessed with Kate, the angst of that is at least rooted in something, i.e. the loss of a parent, that feels real and understandable, even if it is irrational. And again, the rom-com humor and tone also made it easier for me to stomach some of the Regency era BS that I am not a fan of. And I also did really like Kate, who felt like a heroine in the Elizabeth Bennet mode in many ways. So yeah, fun read, looking forward to season 2. Those are all the books that I read in February. I hope everyone's March has been going well so far. If you have thoughts on Bridgerton, Regency romance, or multi-generational novels, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!